It was a hot savannah afternoon when the letter arrived. The paper felt heavier than it should have, the kind of weight that doesn't come from ink, but from betrayal. I stood on the porch, hands trembling as I read the words again and again. You are no longer permitted to enter the property. My own son, Daniel, had sent it. For a moment I thought it had to be a mistake, some mix-up, some cruel misunderstanding. I called him again and again until finally he answered. His voice was calm, almost businesslike. You did what you had to do as a mother, he said, but I don't owe you anything. It felt like the world shifted under my feet. Those words didn't just hurt, they erased me. I had spent decades building a life, a home, a son I believed would carry love forward. Now all I could feel was the sting of being unwanted. I remember standing in the quiet kitchen that day, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound left to remind me I still existed. I looked around at the walls I'd once painted with joy. The photos of Daniel as a child, his missing front teeth, the paper crown he made for me on Mother's Day, and wondered how we got here. When you've poured your life into someone, when every choice you've made has been for them, rejection doesn't just wound it erases purpose. I had raised Daniel alone after my husband passed, worked 2 jobs, skipped meals, so he'd never go hungry. I didn't expect gratitude. I only hoped for love, or at least decency. But that letter told me love had limits. That evening I opened the drawer beside my bed. Inside was my will written just months earlier. I had named Daniel as my only heir, the house the saving, even my grandmother's gold ring. I had believed that leaving everything to him was an act of love. But as I held that document under the dim light, something inside me cracked. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. Because sometimes the people we love most are the ones who take our kindness as weakness. That night I sat in silence for a long time, thinking about what kind of mother I wanted to be in this final chapter of my life. A silent one, a scared one, or one who finally stood up, not out of spite but out of self-respect. I realized then that losing a child's affection is a heartbreak, but losing your dignity is a choice. That was the moment I decided to rewrite everything. I wasn't always this guarded. Before the silence, before the letter, before my son's voice turned to stone, my life was full of noise, the good kind. The laughter of children echoing down the hallway, the clatter of school books, the gentle creak of an old porch swing that knew all my secrets. My name is Evelyn Brooks. I'm 68, a retired elementary school teacher from Savannah. For 35 years, I spent my days teaching children how to read, tie their shoes, and believe they were good enough. And then I'd come home to do it all over again with my own boy, Daniel. When my husband passed from cancer, Daniel was only 6. I remember sitting in the hospital parking lot that night, clutching the steering wheel, wondering how on earth I was going to raise him alone. But you don't really think in moments like that, you just do. You get up the next day, pack lunches, pay bills, and promise yourself you'll keep going no matter what. Back then, money was tight. I taught during the day and tutored neighborhood kids in the evenings. On weekends, I worked the register at a local bakery just to keep the lights on. I used to joke that I smelled like chalk dust and cinnamon rolls. But even on the hardest days, Daniel was my reason. His curiosity was endless. He'd ask why the moon followed our car home, or why the ocean never spilled over its edge. He made me feel like the world still had wonder left in it. Our little house wasn't much, but it was filled with warmth. On Christmas mornings, we'd bake cookies that always burned at the edges. On rainy days, we'd make forts out of old quilts and read stories until we fell asleep mid-sentence. Every corner of that home had a piece of us in it. The pencil marks on the wall tracking his growth, the scuff marks from his soccer cleats, the sound of him laughing in his sleep. I gave up dating. I gave up vacations. Everything I had went into giving him a better life. And when he walked across that stage to accept his college diploma, the first in our family to ever do so, I cried so hard I embarrassed him. But it wasn't pride that made me cry. It was relief. I thought all the sacrifices had finally been worth it. For years, I believed that kind of love was unbreakable, that a mother's devotion could weather anything. But I've learned that love without boundaries can sometimes turn into a leash, one that others use to pull you wherever they please. Looking back now, I realize I didn't just raise Daniel. I built my whole identity around him. I told myself that if he was happy, I'd done my job. I never stopped to ask if he still saw me as a person or just a safety net he could step over once he no longer needed it. I used to believe that raising a good child meant giving them everything. Now I understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to stop giving. After I retired, I thought I finally had time to breathe. For once, I wanted slow mornings with coffee on the porch, maybe join a book club, or take that watercolor class I'd been putting off for years. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. The grocery store floor had just been mopped, and I was in a hurry. My foot slipped, my hip hit the tile, and everything went white. The doctors said it was a clean fracture, but recovery would be long. Suddenly, I couldn't even walk to the mailbox without help. The house I had once loved felt like an obstacle course. The stairs turned into cliffs, the kitchen counters too high, the nights too quiet. When Daniel and his wife Sophie offered to let me move into their guest house, I hesitated. I didn't want to be a burden, but they insisted. "Mum, this is your home too," Daniel said, smiling. Those words wrapped around my heart like a warm blanket. For the first time in months, I felt safe. The guest house was small but cozy. There was a soft rug that smelled faintly of lavender, and Sophie had filled the pantry with my favorite tea. I set up my old rocking chair by the window where sunlight spilled in every morning. It felt like a fresh start, a gentle landing after a hard fall. At first, everything seemed perfect. I cooked when I could told bedtime stories to my grandkids, and baked the same banana bread Daniel used to beg for as a boy. The children's laughter filled my mornings, and the sound of their tiny footsteps across the porch made me feel alive again. I thought maybe this was what peace looked like, being surrounded by family, giving love where it was needed, and receiving kindness in return. Sometimes Daniel would stop by after work to chat. He'd tell me about new projects or show me pictures from their weekend trips. Sophie would bring over little gifts, a candle, a potted plant, and say, "We're just glad you're here." It wasn't extravagant, but it was enough. After so many lonely years, I started to believe that this was my reward for surviving all the storms. I remember sitting by the window one night listening to the crickets, thinking how lucky I was. I whispered to myself, "You did it, Evelyn. You made it through." If I had known then how fragile that peace really was, how quickly warmth can turn into control, I might have seen the signs sooner. But in that moment, I didn't question anything. I just believed my son when he said, "This is your home too." Those words would soon echo back to me, not as comfort, but as a cruel reminder of how easily love can twist into something else. It started small, so small, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. One evening I came back from my walk and noticed the air in my guest house felt colder than usual. I went to adjust the thermostat, but a message flashed across the screen, locked by admin. I didn't even know a thermostat could be locked. I called out to Daniel that night, a little laugh in my voice, trying not to sound annoyed. He barely looked up from his phone. "Oh, we had to lock it for the kids," he said. "They keep playing with it." But the kids rarely came up to the guest house. It didn't make sense. Still, I'll let it go. You tell yourself not to make a fuss, especially when you're living under someone else's roof. Then it was the door, the one that led from the guest house into the main home. It used to be open most of the time, so I could visit or bring dinner over. One afternoon, I walked up with a pie still warm from the oven, but the handle didn't turn. The keypad code I'd always used had been changed. I knocked softly, pretending not to notice. When Sophie finally opened it, she stood there smiling, but her eyes didn't match the smile. "Oh, sorry," she said quickly. "We just had to change the code for security." Behind her, the kitchen was spotless. Too spotless. No clutter, no noise, just that faint smell of expensive perfume lingering in the air. She didn't invite me in, just took the pie and thanked me. That was the first time I felt truly unwelcome in a place I was told was my home too. Days passed, and little things kept disappearing. A jar of peaches I'd bought from the market, a box of cereal, my favorite mug. At first I thought I was being forgetful. It happens at this age, right? But then it was my medication. The bottle I kept in the top drawer was half empty, even though I'd barely taken any. The cap was loose, and it smelled faintly of something bitter. When I mentioned it to Sophie, she didn't even look up from her tablet. "The kids know better than to touch your things," she said flatly, as if I'd accused her of something. There was a distance in her tone I hadn't heard before, a kind of quiet contempt. She used to call me Mum, but lately it was just Evelyn, clipped and cold. I started paying attention to details I once overlooked, the hushed conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the way Daniel's visits grew shorter, how Sophie's laughter seemed to fade the moment I appeared. Even their body language shifted. They'd exchange glances over dinner like I was an uninvited guest, overstaying my welcome. It's strange how quickly warmth can turn into tension, how silence can feel louder than any argument. I told myself not to overthink it, that maybe I was just sensitive after the accident. But deep down, something in my gut whispered otherwise. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed one night, looking around at the cozy little space I'd once loved. The floral curtains, the family photos, the scent of lavender still lingering from the day I moved in. It was all the same, yet everything had changed. That was when the first crack appeared, not in the walls, but in trust. One afternoon, I decided to get some fresh air. The sun was high, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and gasoline from Daniel's workshop. I was walking past the side of the house when I heard voices coming from the garage. At first, I didn't think much of it. Daniel often met with contractors or financial people there, but something about the tone, low, careful, secretive, made me pause. I moved closer just enough to hear without being seen. Daniel stood with a man I didn't recognize, younger, dressed in a sharp grey suit, clipboard in hand. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that deals in signatures and silence. "We'll list it in her name first," the man said. "Then transfer it over once everything's finalized. She'll never notice." Daniel nodded, flipping through a few pages. "That's fine. Just make it look official." I felt the blood drain from my face. They were standing just a few yards away, talking about me like I was a business transaction. My name, my house, my life being shuffled around like paperwork. I stepped back, hiding behind the hedge, my heart thudding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. List what? Transfer what? My mind raced, trying to piece it together. I had already signed over my old house to Daniel years ago as a gesture of trust. It was supposed to be symbolic, a way of keeping the family home safe. But now, hearing him talk that way, it sounded like I'd handed him a loaded weapon and turned my back. By the time I reached my guest house, my knees were trembling. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. They were shaking not from age, but from realization. Maybe this wasn't just distance or tension. Maybe this was something darker. That night, I replayed every strange moment of the past few months. The locked thermostat, the changed door code, Sophie's cold smile, the missing medication. Each one suddenly made sense. They weren't accidents or oversights. They were tests, steps, a slow, quiet removal of control. I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the room, thinking about how betrayal never happens all at once. It starts like this, in whispers, in half-truths, in signatures you never meant to give. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I sat up and said it out loud to the empty room. They're planning something. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was instinct. And for the first time in my life, I realized that trusting my gut might be the only thing left protecting me. The next morning, I made coffee like nothing had happened. I smiled at Sophie when she waved from the porch, and I waved back. But inside, something in me had shifted. I wasn't the same woman who moved in with gratitude and blind faith. I had seen the first glimpse of a plan that could destroy everything I'd worked for. And if they thought I would just sit quietly and let it happen, they didn't know me at all. A few days later, curiosity turned into resolve. I couldn't shake the sound of Daniel's voice in that garage, the way he said it so casually. She'll never notice. I needed to know what he meant. One morning after Daniel left for work and Sophie took the kids to school, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the hallway clock. I stood at the foot of the stairs for a long moment, debating whether to go up. Every decent part of me said no. I wasn't a snoop. I was a mother. But another part of me, the part that had spent months being locked out and lied to, whispered otherwise. So I climbed the stairs. The door to Daniel's office was usually locked, but that day the latch clicked open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Stacks of papers covered the desk in neat piles, the kind of order that hides chaos. I hesitated before touching anything, then began to scan the folders: insurance forms, tax documents, property statements. Nothing unusual. Until I saw my name, a folder labeled E. Brooks sat on the corner of the desk. I opened it, my stomach tightening. The first page read, Power of Attorney. My name appeared several times alongside Daniel's, and at the bottom my signature curved steady, too perfect. For a moment my brain refused to believe what my eyes saw. It looked exactly like my handwriting down to the small loop I made on every Y, but something about it felt off. The pressure was uniform, no hesitations, no tiny imperfections that come from a real pen in a trembling hand. I flipped to the next page, Property Transfer Authorization. It stated that I had voluntarily gifted the remaining assets from my late husband's estate, including my current living space, to Daniel. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My knees wobbled. I gripped the desk to stay upright. Had I signed something like this? No. I remembered signing some papers years ago when I first moved in. But not this. Not this specific. Not this final. I ran my fingers over the signature again. This time, feeling for something, the slight indentation a pen leaves when it meets paper. It was faint, but wrong, too smooth. That was when I realized it wasn't just copied, it was traced. My own son had forged my name. A sound from downstairs made me freeze. A door closing, then silence. My heart raced. I shoved the papers back exactly where I'd found them, careful not to crease a single page. Then I slipped out, my breath shallow, each step heavier than the last. Back in my guest house, I closed the door and sat in the dark. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I thought about the years of trust I'd handed him without question, the nights I prayed for his success, the sacrifices no one ever saw. All of it now reduced to a signature he had stolen. It's a strange kind of heartbreak, the kind that doesn't come from loss, but from realization. The moment you understand someone you love has already crossed a line you can never uncross. That night I didn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my head, every detail, every possibility. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was some logical reason. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. And if Daniel was willing to fake my signature, then he was willing to take everything. By morning, the shock had turned into something sharper. I wasn't powerless, not yet. If he wanted to treat me like I wouldn't notice, then it was time to start proving I could. I poured myself a cup of coffee, steadied my hands, and whispered into the steam. You picked the wrong mother to underestimate. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I pulled out the small fireproof box I kept under my bed and unlocked it. Inside, neatly folded between old bank statements and photographs, was my original will, the one my lawyer and I had written 10 years ago. My hands trembled as I opened it. Every page smelled faintly of paper and dust, the scent of something honest and untouched. I read it slowly, line by line. My son Daniel was listed as a beneficiary, yes, but so was the local women's shelter that my late husband and I had supported for years. There were clear condition protections and small personal notes I had added with care. That document carried my real signature, shaky, imperfect human. Then I compared it to the copy Daniel had in his office, the one I'd seen the day before. My stomach dropped. His version was different. The charity was gone. Every protective clause had been rewritten. It gave Daniel full control, no questions, no limits, no oversight. The structure looked professional, the formatting clean, but the heart of it was missing. It wasn't my voice anymore. It was his. I stared at both signatures side by side. My real one slanted slightly to the left, a little uneven like all my handwriting. The other was flawless. Too flawless. Steady lines, no pressure points, no smudges. It was as if someone had traced it carefully, deliberately. Still, I needed to be sure. I couldn't accuse my son without proof. So I drove across town to visit Marlene, a retired notary and an old friend of my husband's. She had notarized our first mortgage decades ago and had a sharp eye for details most people missed. She greeted me with a hug and that no-nonsense kindness that only age can teach. When I handed her the two wills, she didn't say much at first. She adjusted her glasses, turned on a small desk lamp, and pulled out a magnifying glass. After a few quiet minutes, she frowned. This one, she said, tapping Daniel's version, was traced. See this ridge? The pressure's inconsistent, and there's a faint outline underneath. Someone probably used a printed template of your real signature and went over it with a pen. Her words landed like a punch to the gut. I felt cold all over, as if the room itself had shrunk around me. She looked at me with sympathy, but didn't sugarcoat it. Evelyn, she said gently, this isn't a misunderstanding. It's forgery. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the papers spread across her desk. It's strange how quickly life can turn from trust to betrayal, from warmth to calculation. I thought of all the times I had defended Daniel, when people said he was too ambitious, too detached. I thought of every meal I'd cooked, every call I'd answered, every sacrifice I'd made. And now here was the truth proof that my own child had tried to erase me from my own story. When I finally spoke, my voice barely made a sound. He didn't just forge my name, he tried to rewrite my life. Marlene reached over and touched my hand. Then it's time you take your life back. On the drive home, the streets of Savannah blurred past my window. I don't even remember stopping at the lights. All I could think about was how fragile love becomes when mixed with greed. I realized that this wasn't just about money or property, it was about control, about someone deciding I no longer had a say in my own life. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the fear had burned itself into something sharper. Not anger exactly, but clarity. I wasn't the frail old woman Daniel thought I was. I was still the woman who had survived widowhood, poverty, and loneliness, and I wasn't about to let my own son steal my future out from under me. That night, I placed both wills side by side on my kitchen table. I turned on every light in the room as if brightness could chase away the betrayal. Then I took a deep breath and whispered the words I hadn't said in years enough. Tomorrow I would start gathering proof. I didn't know how far Daniel and Sophie were willing to go, but I knew this I was going to find out. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the two wills lying side by side. I wasn't just angry anymore. The fear had burned off, replaced by something colder, steadier, a kind of quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to wait for Daniel to make his next move. It was time to make mine. The next morning, I drove into town and bought a small indoor security camera. Nothing fancy, just one of those discreet ones that looks like a regular wall clock. I told the clerk it was for keeping an eye on the dog. He smiled politely. I didn't tell him I was really keeping an eye on my own son. Back home, I installed the camera in the living room, angled just right to see the door and my desk. It looked harmless, almost decorative. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of control creeping back in. If Daniel or Sophie were up to something, I needed proof, undeniable proof. I didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, around 2 a.m., the soft click of a door woke me. I froze, listening. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest. Through the thin wall, I could hear drawers, opening papers, shifting. I wanted to call out, but I stayed still, barely breathing. The next morning, I played back the footage. My hands trembled as the image came into focus. There he was, Daniel, unlocking my door with the emergency key I'd given him for safety. He walked straight to my filing cabinet, opened it, and began flipping through my folders. Then he pulled out my bank statements, held each one under his phone, and took pictures. Every page, every number. I watched in disbelief. The son I once rocked to sleep was now cataloguing my accounts like a thief. When he finished, he calmly put everything back, locked the door behind him, and left. No hesitation, no guilt. I sat there for a long time afterward, the room spinning around me. It wasn't the money that broke me, it was the ease, the comfort in his movements, the familiarity as if he'd done it before. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. This was routine. Grief came first. Then came anger. But anger, I learned, can be useful if you point it in the right direction. I saved the video to 3 separate USB drives, one for my lawyer, one for my old friend Marlene, and one for myself. I labeled them quietly in my neat teacher's handwriting and locked them away in different places. Years of teaching kids had taught me one thing: always keep a backup plan. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was acting. I no longer felt like the frail woman living at the mercy of her family's goodwill. I was a woman building her own defense. One file, one timestamp, one truth at a time. As I sealed the last envelope, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. I may have raised a man who forgot his conscience, but I hadn't forgotten how to fight for what's right. That night, I slept with the lights off for the first time in weeks, not because I wasn't scared, but because I was finally ready. That Sunday, I invited Daniel and Sophie over for lunch. I wanted it to look ordinary, no tension, no suspicion, just a family meal like old times. I roasted a chicken, baked his favorite cornbread, and set the table with the good dishes I rarely used anymore. Every detail was deliberate, every movement calm. They thought they were coming for comfort food and small talk, They had no idea this meal would be the last one we'd ever share as a family. When they arrived, Sophie greeted me with her practiced smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Daniel kissed my cheek quickly, his phone still in his hand. We ate in silence for the first few minutes, the clinking of silverware louder than words. I waited until the plates were cleared before I reached for the manila folder sitting on the counter. I placed it gently in the center of the table. Sophie glanced at Daniel, then at me. "What's that?" she asked, her tone light, but her shoulders tight. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the folder and pulled out 3 sheets of paper, followed by a small USB drive. My voice was steady, almost detached. "These," I said, "are the things you hoped I'd never see." Daniel frowned, half irritated, half confused. "Mum?" "What are you talking about?" I pressed play on the small tablet I'd set up beside me. The footage from the hidden camera filled the room. Daniel unlocking my door in the middle of the night, rifling through my drawers, photographing my bank statements like they were grocery coupons. For a moment, no one spoke. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the ceiling fan, even the soft rustle of Sophie's sleeve as she froze in her chair. Daniel's face went pale. "That's not what it looks like," he muttered. "It looks—" I said evenly, like my son breaking into his mother's room. He opened his mouth to speak, but I wasn't finished. I slid the next set of papers toward him, the forged will and power of attorney. I'd marked the differences in red ink the way I used to correct essays when I was still teaching. "And this," I continued, "is what you've done with my name." Sophie reached for the papers, her fingers trembling. "We were just trying to help you organize things," she said quickly, her voice sugar-coated with panic. "By erasing me from my own will?" I asked. My tone never rose, but the air around us thickened with truth. Daniel looked at me, then not like a son, but like a man cornered. "You always think the worst of me," he said. "You never trust me to handle things." "Trust is earned," I replied softly. "And you lost it the moment you used my love as a tool." I stood, sliding the final page across the table, an official amendment notarized by my lawyer, removing Daniel and Sophie from my will entirely. My hands didn't shake this time. "As of today," I said, "you are no longer included in my estate. Every asset, every title, every cent gone. Consider this your notice." Sophie gasped. Daniel's jaw clenched. For once, he had no clever defense, no smooth explanation, just silence. He looked down at the evidence, the undeniable proof of his choices. "You're really doing this?" he asked finally, his voice barely a whisper. I met his eyes. The same eyes that once looked up at me after every scraped knee and bad dream. "I didn't do this," I said. "You did." The moment stretched between us, fragile and final. Then Daniel pushed his chair back, muttering something I couldn't catch. Sophie followed her heels, clicking across the tile. They left without another word. When the door closed, the house fell completely still. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty chairs, the plates still smeared with gravy. Part of me wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was free. It's strange how liberation can feel like loss at first. How taking back your power can leave such an ache in your chest. But as I gathered the dishes and rinsed them under warm water, I realized something. Peace doesn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes it comes after a storm. And that day, I had finally weathered mine. The day after that lunch, I woke up to a strange quiet. It wasn't the heavy silence of grief anymore. It was something cleaner, sharper, like the air after a storm. For the first time in months, I felt clear. I had spent too long reacting, defending, surviving. Now it was time to rebuild. That morning, I called my lawyer, Evelyn Carter, a woman I'd met through a local seniors support group. She specialized in elder protection and estate fraud. And from the moment she answered the phone, I knew I was in the right hands. Her voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that turns fear into action. We met that afternoon in her office downtown, a small space filled with framed degrees and the faint scent of lemon polish. When I placed the folder of evidence in front of her videos, forged documents, and Marlene's notarized statement, she reviewed every page without interrupting. Then she looked up and said, "You have more than enough to protect yourself. This isn't just a mistake, Evelyn. It's a deliberate act." Hearing that from someone who understood the law didn't break me. It steadied me. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being dramatic. I was right. Together we drafted the new will. Every line, every clause, every name mattered. This time, Daniel's name never appeared. Instead, I left my estate to two recipients, the Savannah Women's Resilience Fund, which helps older women escape abusive family situations, and Rosa, my housekeeper and friend, the only person who had stood by me without expecting anything in return. Signing that document felt like crossing a bridge I'd been afraid to step on. My hand shook a little, not from weakness, but from relief. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control over a life I had almost lost. Afterward, Evelyn Carter helped me revoke the old power of attorney that Daniel had manipulated. We filed a police report, not to have him arrested, but to create a legal record, a line in the sand that said this happened and it will not happen again. She set up alerts on my financial accounts, updated passwords, and walked me through steps to safeguard everything from my online banking to the title of my home. By the time we finished, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: safe. That night I went home, poured myself a glass of tea, and sat in the quiet of my guest house. The air smelled of rosemary from the garden. I looked at the new will lying on my table, stamped and sealed, and realized I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that office earlier. I had gone from someone begging to be believed to someone who didn't need permission to act. I had proof. I had protection. I had peace. Later I called Rosa and told her what I'd done. She cried, which made me cry too. But then she laughed and said, "You finally stood up for yourself, Miss Evelyn. I knew you would." After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, just breathing. The fear that once kept me awake at night had turned into something quieter, something stronger: independence. I thought about Daniel not as the boy I raised, but as the man he'd become. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, a boundary, and that I realized was the true meaning of freedom: not running away, but choosing peace over pain. Before bed, I opened the windows and let the night breeze drift through. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and the wind carried the smell of rain. I whispered to the darkness, half prayer, half declaration: "You took my trust, but you didn't take my will." In every sense of the word. I had rewritten it, my future, my name, my story, and this time it belonged entirely to me. A few weeks later, I packed the last of my things into a small box and closed the door of the guest house for good. The house that once felt like shelter now carried too many echoes. Locked doors, whispered conversations, and the quiet sting of betrayal. I didn't look back. Some chapters don't deserve rereading. I moved into a small bungalow near the beach in Savannah, a place where the salt air mixed with jasmine and mornings began with the sound of gulls instead of tension. It wasn't large, but it was mine. The locks were new. The passwords changed, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my own keys in my hand. That simple sound, A key turning in a door that belonged only to me felt like freedom. My new home had chipped paint and a garden that needed love, but every imperfection made it feel real. I spent the first morning opening every window, letting sunlight flood the rooms until even the corners felt alive again. I painted the kitchen a soft coral, the same color I had once dreamed of using, but never did, because Daniel said it was too bright. Now it was perfect. Each day became its own small act of healing. I started walking along the shoreline at sunrise, the cool sand pressing against my feet. The ocean reminding me that everything broken eventually comes back to shore. I picked up seashells, little reminders that beauty can survive being tossed and shattered. Rosa visited often, bringing homemade tamales and stories that made me laugh until I cried. We'd sit on the porch swing, drinking coffee, listening to the waves crash in the distance. "You're glowing again," she said once. Maybe I was. Peace has a way of showing on your face. Eventually, I joined a watercolor class at the community center. The instructor, a woman about my age with paint-stained fingers, told me on the first day, "Don't worry about being good. Just let the brush move." That sentence became my new mantra. I wasn't painting to be perfect. I was painting because it felt like breathing. Every stroke on the paper was a step toward forgiving not for them, but for myself. On Thursdays, I started volunteering at the local library, reading to children during story hour. Their laughter filled the room, innocent and bright. Sometimes a little girl would grab my hand and ask, "Can you read another one?" Miss Evelyn and I'd think, "Yes, always," because stories heal. They remind us we're not alone, even when we feel like we are. Slowly, my life took shape again. Not the life I used to have, but one that fit me better. I learned that starting over isn't failure, it's choosing yourself. It's giving your heart permission to rest and your spirit room to grow. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset turn the water gold. I'd think about Daniel, not with bitterness, but with distance. Forgiveness, I've learned, yeah, it doesn't mean letting someone back in. It means releasing the weight they left behind. People often say time heals everything. I don't think that's true. Healing takes choices, small, deliberate ones. Getting up, moving forward, deciding not to carry pain into tomorrow. The day I realized I could look at the ocean and not feel broken was the day I knew I was free. I may never trust the same way again, but that's all right. Trust, like art, is something you build from scratch, with patience, with care, and with the understanding that it's okay if it looks different than before. Because forgiveness is possible, but trust must be rebuilt. There are moments in life when you think the story is over, when loss feels final, and silence feels like the only sound left. But I've learned something in these last few months. Endings are often just the start of a different kind of peace. I used to believe strength meant holding on to family loyalty, promises even when they broke me. Now I understand that sometimes strength is knowing when to let go. It's walking away, not out of bitterness, but out of love for yourself. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: you have the right to start over, even if the person who betrayed you carries your last name. You are allowed to choose peace over chaos, dignity over guilt, and freedom over fear. Starting over doesn't always mean moving cities or changing your name. Sometimes it means changing how you speak to yourself. It means saying "I deserve more" and believing it. It means locking a door that once hurt you and opening a window that lets in light again. I know some of you watching have faced your own version of this, being taken for granted, ignored, or made to feel invisible. You may have raised people who forgot where they came from, or trusted someone who saw your kindness as weakness. But I promise you, you are not alone. You still have time to take your life back, piece by piece, choice by choice. Maybe your first step is small, calling a lawyer, talking to a friend, changing a password, or simply saying no without apology. Every act of self-respect is a declaration of freedom. Today I live quietly. My mornings begin with tea and the sound of the ocean. I paint. I volunteer. I laugh with people who see me not what I can give them. And every time I lock my front door at night, I feel the calm of knowing I am safe, not just physically, but emotionally. So if my story reaches even one person who feels trapped, controlled, or forgotten, I hope it reminds you that it's never too late. You can rewrite your will, your choices, your future, whatever it takes to reclaim your voice. And if you've walked a similar path, I'd love to hear from you. Share your story, your advice, or even just your thoughts below. Someone out there might need your words the way you once needed someone else's. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength, please like, share, and subscribe. Not for me, but for the people who still need to hear that they matter, because we all deserve to be seen, to be safe, and to be heard, no matter how old we are, no matter who failed us. And remember, peace isn't something you find, it's something you choose every single day.